Hey there, welcome back to Win the Day, brought to you by Back to the Bible. I'm your host, Jacob Wirka, filling in for Pastor Nat, and today we're going to look at how suffering can actually be a blessing. Today, we're finishing up Jesus' teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, commonly known as the Beatitudes, which means blessing. Now, what comes to mind when you think of the word blessing? Oftentimes, I'm convinced that we think of people who are getting things that they want or who have special talents and abilities. If you search the hashtag blessed on virtually any social media site, you're sure to find posts about nice vacations or fancy cars or maybe even people flexing at the gym. But I think a better definition for blessing would be to find favor or approval from God. Now let's keep that in mind as we look together at Matthew 5, verses 10 through 12. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' powerful explanation of what it looks like to live on earth as a citizen of heaven. Now to this point, Jesus has been explaining how God's people recognize their spiritual poverty, how they mourn for their sin, how they're gentle and meek, how they desire to live rightly, and how they show mercy to others. They desire to live with pure motivations and who are seeking to make peace. All of these reflect the nature and the character of Jesus, especially displayed on the cross. With all this in mind, Jesus finishes his sermon this way: "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So Jesus is saying that it is a blessing to be persecuted. But that doesn't seem right. When people turn against us and say bad things about us or even try to harm us, you're telling me we should rejoice? We should be glad? We have to remember that blessings aren't just getting the things that we want, but to be blessed is to have the approval or favor of God. Therefore, we can rejoice and be glad when the world that doesn't know God begins to turn against us, because this is actually a sign that we're doing the right thing. This persecution is coming on God's account. Not based on our own ideas or our own way of doing things. God is still the one who's in control. And because this is happening to us on His account, we can be sure that He will right every wrong one day. The reality is that good has always been opposed to evil, and that the way of God has always been against the way of this world. Remember, we aren't alone in our suffering. When we suffer for our faith, we actually join all the saints who have suffered before us. Most importantly, we join Jesus. If we want to join Jesus in His righteousness, then we must be willing to suffer and join Jesus in His suffering. So how should we respond to persecution? We have to look to Jesus and His example. Isaiah 53 verse 7 says this: "He was oppressed and He was afflicted, yet He opened not His mouth. Like a lamb that was led to the slaughter, like a sheep that was before his shearers is silent, so He opened not His mouth." When Jesus was put on trial, evil things were said about Him, and He was being falsely accused. He was being beaten and He was being mocked, and yet He said nothing. Jesus isn't asking us to do anything that He hasn't already done Himself. Remember, when you're being persecuted for your faith, you're following in the footsteps of Jesus. We have to go through this Christian journey with eternity in mind. Persecution and suffering are extremely difficult to endure. And it'll look differently for every believer. But we have to remember that there is a reward for us in eternity. When we embrace the gospel message by faith, it begins to transform us. Jesus is showing us in His Sermon on the Mount that God's ways of doing things and His motivations are very different than our way of doing things or this world's way of doing things. We should be joyful as we see our hearts begin to change. We should be joyful when we see this world that doesn't know God is turning against us, because it's evidence that we know God and that we are His people, and that is the greatest blessing.